Welcome back to U.S. History. In case you forgot what class you are in, this is the first video of Week 5. So you should have turned in your Week 4 packet, turned in the one quiz from Chapter 22. Make sure that you've gotten that turned in, and you should have picked up all the things you needed for your Week 5 packet. We are at Roman numeral 4. We're finishing up World War II. Pushing back the Axis. Remember, up to this point, the Axis had been winning up until about 1941, 1942, but then by that point on, the Allies began turning the tide. The U.S. won some key victories in the Pacific, Midway, Coral Sea, for example, and then over in Europe, the Allies had defeated the Germans in North Africa, and then had pushed into Italy, where they had forced Italy's surrender, and then the Normandy invasion was the beginning of the end for Hitler's empire. So as we get going, we're finishing up the chapter. When the U.S. joined World War II, Army strategists concluded that primary emphasis would be placed on defeating Hitler first, but because he was considered to be the more dangerous enemy. But while most resources were sent to Europe, U.S. troops continued to fight the Japanese as well. Fighting in the Pacific would be just as bloody as the U.S. pushed itself from island to island closer to Japan. We're on page 513 in our textbooks. On page 513, it shows you a good map of World War II in the Pacific, so you can refer to this map to see some of the places that we'll be talking about now. Letter A. Island hopping, and there's another map on the screen for you to see. Island hopping became the U.S. strategy to win the war. The plan was to bypass heavily fortified islands and secure air bases on those islands that were less fortified. These air bases were used by U.S. bombers to disrupt other Japanese fortifications and cut off supply and communication lines. Instead of trying to retake every island that the Japanese had conquered, the U.S. took key islands on a path to Japan. First battle that we're going to identify is the Battle of Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal was a 90-mile-long jungle island. Japan had begun constructing an airbase to use as an invasion of Australia. You can see where Guadalcanal is located on the map here, so right in this area. After several sea battles and months of jungle fighting, Japanese forces abandoned the island to the U.S. An individual who gained some fame during this time, perhaps you've heard of him before. Well, I'll just tell you about him. During the fierce fightings in the Solomon Islands, which included Guadalcanal, the torpedo boat PT-109 was commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy. Around 2 a.m. on August 2, 1943, it was sliced in two by the Japanese destroyer Amagiri. Although Kennedy was injured, he gathered his men and swam 3 miles to shore with them. They were in the water for about 30 hours. For his service, Kennedy received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal as well as the Purple Heart. So, claim to fame for John F. Kennedy. Of course, he'll become famous as president next chapter. From the end of 1942 to 1943, the U.S. slowly began retaking key Pacific islands, including the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Aleutian Islands. So, Battle of Guadalcanal, just real quickly, the U.S. wins. The Battle of the Marianas. In 1944, the Japanese defense became more desperate, but the U.S. continued to win. The new U.S. warplanes devastated the Japanese planes, knocking them out of the sky. By capturing the Marianas, U.S. bombing raids could commence on occupied Philippines and also on Japan itself. Next, the fight for the Philippines, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, notable for you guys to know, it was the largest sea battle in history. It proved to be a critical blow to Japanese naval and air forces. Japan lost 3 battleships, 9 cruisers, 10 destroyers, and 180 aircraft. The defeat led the U.S. to push into the rest of the Philippines. You can see Leyte Gulf located right here on the map. Kamikazes. Out of desperation, Japan began organizing squadrons of suicide pilots, that's what you need to know about kamikazes, that would blow themselves up into U.S. ships. Although many of the fanatical missions were stopped by concentrated anti-aircraft fire, too many got through. The kamikazes sank or crippled 300 U.S. warships in the final 10 months of the war and inflicted 10,000 casualties. But in the end, after retaking the Philippines, MacArthur was able to keep his promise. When he went ashore, he greeted the cheering crowds with the phrase, "I have returned." The U.S. was able to retake the Philippines. Another battle was in Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is a tiny speck of volcanic ash, which will become famous only for the battle that was fought there. The Battle of Iwo Jima proved to be, and this is worth noting, the costliest battle in the history of the U.S. Marines. By the way, Iwo Jima on the map's located right up here. Costliest battle in the history of the U.S. Marines. The Japanese fought for every foot of black sand through the cave-infested volcano. Against the 21,000 Japanese defenders, over 6,800 Marines died and 20,000 more were wounded before the Japanese resistance collapsed. It was said of the Battle of Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. And then we have the Battle of Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa, worth noting, proved to be the bloodiest battle in the Pacific. Okinawa is located right here on the map. Bloodiest battle in the Pacific. This was to be the last island that the U.S. needed for its island-hopping campaign. The U.S. saw victory in Okinawa as the dagger to pierce Japan mortally. Japan saw defeat as the beginning of the end. The fight for the island took 2.5 months. The Japanese sent their last Navy fleet, including their largest ship, the Yamato, on a suicide mission to try to dislodge the U.S. Almost 2,000 kamikazes were used against the U.S. Navy, sinking 38 ships and killing 5,000 men. At the end of the battle, 12,000 Americans were dead and 50,000 were injured. Of the 117,000 Japanese casualties, 110,000 were killed. Only those too weak to kill themselves when found by the U.S. were captured. Thousands of Japanese civilians also died. Okinawa was, after all, a Japanese territory before the war, so many Japanese civilians also died. Before the fighting, the Japanese troops had given them grenades to fight the Americans. They were to use all of their grenades except their last one for the purpose of committing suicide. Other civilians, believing that being captured by the U.S. was worse than death, jumped from the cliffs onto jagged rocks or into the sea to their deaths. After the battle, many Americans feared the dangers of invading the homeland of Japan, where estimates were the U.S. would lose 1 million soldiers to take the country. Unfortunately, Japanese propaganda for its own civilians caused them to take their own lives. Very sad. Letter B. Planning for victory. The Big Three at Yalta. In early 1945, the three leaders of the Allies met in Yalta in the Soviet Union. The Big Three included Roosevelt for the U.S., Churchill for Britain, and Stalin for the Soviet Union. It's also during this time that FDR is elected to a fourth unprecedented term in 1944. In fact, the hardest issue wasn't whether or not FDR would be reelected, but rather who would be the new vice president. Democrats chose little-known Harry S. Truman to fill the post. With the war drawing to a close, the Yalta Conference was to organize a post-war world. So, at Yalta, first thing they did was they established the United Nations. FDR and others thought that one of the reasons for World War II was because the U.S. had not joined the League of Nations. The Yalta Conference was intended to establish a new international organization called the United Nations, the UN. Number 2, unfortunately for Britain and the U.S., they were failing to control Stalin. FDR believed he could handle Stalin. He would be wrong. The Big Three agreed to support democratic elections and government in all of the liberated nations of Europe. Stalin agreed, all the while the Soviet army was destroying the democratic forces in Eastern Europe and setting up puppet governments controlled by communists. But because FDR felt he needed Stalin's support in finishing off Japan later, he didn't press the issue. Shortly after Yalta, FDR died. Weeks after the conference at Yalta, moments before the final triumph in Europe and Japan, FDR died. The vice president for less than 3 months, Truman, became the new president, the first new president in over 12 years. As the war continued to draw to a close, there's Harry S. Truman there. As the war continued to draw to a close, the Holocaust became more evident. The Holocaust describes Hitler's massacre of millions of people, especially Jews, in Europe. On page 516, I want you to read the box entitled The Holocaust to yourself. Once you have finished reading, please unpause and we will continue. Letter C, victory. Number 1, victory in Europe. April 12th, FDR died. April 20th, Hitler, quote-unquote, celebrated his 56th birthday. As Soviets bombed Berlin above, he sat in his secret bunker below. April 27th, Mussolini was discovered by anti-fascist Italians. He was arrested, shot the following day, and his body was hung upside down in Milan for crowds to view. On April 30th, as the Soviets closed in, Hitler committed suicide. On May 8th, 1945, on a very testable date, Germany surrendered, and VE, Victory in Europe Day, is celebrated. President Truman declared that by working with our allies, a long-lasting peace would succeed. Easier said than done. Number 2, the Potsdam Conference. The new Big Three. Harry Truman was not the only new face at the conference. Churchill's party had been voted out of office, and his replacement was Clement Attlee. Old Stalin remained the solitary constant to these meetings. So the new Big Three includes Truman, Attlee, Attlee, and Stalin, of course. Stalin had established puppet governments in Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe. All Truman could do was to remind Stalin about his promises. Stalin boasted, "This war is unlike all past wars. Whoever occupies a territory imposes his own social system as far as his army can advance." Truman learned that testing for the atomic bomb had been successful. The secret weapon awaited the president's order for use against Japan. Number 3, the conclusion of the war. The U.S. warned Japan to surrender or face total destruction. Japan rejected the offer. On August 6th, Colonel Paul Tibbets flew his B-29 plane called the Enola Gay and dropped the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. Half of the city was wiped out in a single blast. On August 9th, the second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. At this point, Emperor Hirohito accepted the inevitable. And on September 2nd, 1945, on a very testable date, Japan surrendered, ending World War II. Debates have been asked about whether or not the U.S. should have used these bombs in this war, but the fact of the matter was it did help end the war, and it did save many American lives. Number 4. Destruction had again ravaged Europe for the second time in the same century. Millions had died. Around 50 million people died. It proved to be the deadliest war in history. Around 400,000 Americans died. Having arrived late and protected by the oceans, America suffered fewer casualties than most countries. Leadership was again placed on America in the post-war world. Victory had led America to become the leader of the free world and chief leader against the new emerging threat, the Soviet Union and communism. Vigilance in peace would be as important as vigilance in war. That's the end of the notes. For your homework, it's quizzes 507, 519, plus 133, 134, 135, 136 in the activities book.